Okay, welcome to the Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues in learning design and examine the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. I'm Tony from Ding. I'm very pleased to be joined by Phil from Ding and by our guest, Tony Castro. So Tony, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me.
So Tony, you're a professional development coach and you've had a successful career both as a musician and in higher education. And on your LinkedIn profile, you state that you're helping musicians teaching in higher education adapt to working in an institution so they feel confident, focused, and purposeful again. So that looks like quite a good place to start the discussion. So perhaps maybe could you begin by explaining what is it that you're currently doing as a coach and who do you work with and why?
My primary focus is working with musicians, as you say, but that broadens out into performing arts more generally, as well. I've got some other clients as well. The common factor is that what I found from my own experience as a teacher, as an artist moving into higher education, is that we come with our knowledge. We know what we do. We know what we're good at. And more often than not, that's precisely what we have been employed for, is our practice-based skill set and knowledge. And then we come up against this thing called higher education and everything that flows from degree, with a very big assumption from this institution that we know what on earth that means or what the implications are for us as artists and us as teachers in higher education. And I found that when I moved into more sort of slightly higher up the food chain, education management, this tension between me as artist teacher and me as higher education employee, with everything that goes from institutional life, it started to do my head in, and I could see it in other people. It was really simple, and it starts to get in the way. It starts to, I've talked with clients who find that it provides them with a maze to try and navigate with no compass and not even a sense that there is a goal in the middle to be got. So it's like some cruel permanent maze. There are solutions to it. And so when I was starting to got into training as a professional development coach, I partly started that because I simply wanted to get better at being able to talk with and understand students and staff. We know there's plenty of evidence out there that definitely post-COVID and probably pre-COVID, levels of mental health have become more complex, just more plentiful by anybody's measure, and yet our ability to cope with that and engage with it not necessarily has kept pace with the reality of students with mental health issues, and we forget. It frustrates me greatly. There's a lot of work on student mental health. What about teachers? Where are the teachers in that conversation about how are you feeling today? So I notice you're not contributing quite as much, as you're not as talkative as you normally are. What's going on there? And that conversation seemed not to be happening. And I noticed it more and more when I was, as part of my job, chairing meetings. Sometimes the chatty ones were not. And there's nobody asking the question. What's going on for you? How can we help? So that's why I wanted to get into professional development coaching.
Yeah.
And then suddenly found, the big secret is I haven't yet met an artist working in higher education who did not have some version of these issues.
Yeah, no.
Sorry, Phil.
Yeah, when we were planning the discussion, I think it was that concept of the artist-educator that really stood out to me, because much like yourself, I come from a musical background, and I remember starting in universities in sort of 2007, 2008, and getting put onto a PG cert and not really understanding why I was doing that. And then there was this concept of the Artist-Educator, and that was the first time I'd sort of heard things like dual identity and what does that mean. And then it's a classic example of a threshold concept. You suddenly start to remap your own experience, going, well, I didn't know why I was feeling a bit odd, but now I've got this dual identity. And I know, Phil, you've worked with plenty of creatives in your time, and presumably this is something that you've come up against as well.
Well, I just want to say, I think Tony, I think it's always nice, to be honest with you, just to articulate that idea that the whole of HE is obviously about ensuring that the learning experience of learners, students, that they are having this, ideally this extraordinary, challenging, extraordinary, supportive time. So they're having a great time. And that's where the focus is. And I think it's always refreshing, reassuring and satisfying to hear someone just sort of suddenly remember that there's like a second party going on. There's like another layer to that. And that's all of the people who are seeking to produce that experience. And I think you're right that my experience of working in HE was to be around a community of wonderfully creative peers who, over a cup of coffee in the refectory, while they were like worrying about what their students were doing and feeling, and whether the lecture theatre was going to be ready, and if the projector was working, and if their learning materials were up to scratch, they're wearing all of those things, you would just sometimes, for a moment, stop and think, I think the person I'm talking to is utterly exhausted. I think they're somehow kind of tap dancing, but they're sort of dead behind the eyes, and then suddenly that coffee would be over, and everybody would go off into their rooms, and they would be producing these learning experiences. So I think it's interesting to sort of just say yes, that I absolutely recognise those moments where you suddenly think, hold on, I think that colleague, if I had more time, I would probably be worried about that colleague. But actually, sorry, I'm off, and I'm now worrying about my stuff, and off you go. So I think that's definite space. And I think too, because student satisfaction is so paramount, and everybody understands that, I think also I think there is a possibility sometimes that if a member of staff were to perhaps talk about themselves, sometimes it can feel as if you are pulling in the wrong direction, as if there's a disloyalty there, or if there's you're being unhelpful, or you're being kind of like a negative Nelly, all of those things. Yeah. But yeah, I would say that there are those two, that dual identity of HE sort of staff is both to be the sun shining out and producing energy and heat for lots of people, and often that's costing them sort of an equivalent amount of energy. And it was something that I saw all the time, and I would say that I manifested myself. So and at the same time, and I guess this is one of the things you want to talk about, is you're also trying to sustain your own creativity. You have your own practice. You've got your own identity that is not an educator, and I'm sure that's where those tensions you were talking about really start to like knit together, right?
So how did you navigate that? Is the next question. How did you navigate that dual identity? What was your strategy for survival?
For a long time, I didn't, is the honest answer. For a long time, I simply, I suppose, embedded myself in HE. But that was largely from a needs must basis. I mean, my career path has been so bizarre as to be of no use to anybody else in terms of a model or anything like that. But the fact is, my very first teaching job at all, whether HE or what or anything, was as head of department in a nationally recognized drama school. You know, I had no actual knowledge of what teaching involved. I was a very experienced practitioner in musical theatre and music in particular, but got appointed straight into head of department. No idea what management is, no idea. I mean, it was the most bewildering few weeks. Not least of which, because I'll share, on my very first day, students were protesting on the steps. Fabulous. Welcome.
Congratulations.
You know, okay. And there is a useful thing to be taken out of that, which is what I've found creative teachers, practitioner teachers have in common is that they are incredibly resourceful when it comes to learning on the job. And I think that's a lot to do with their own creative practice, whether it's as musicians learning new repertoire. You know, the UK has the most fantabulous worldwide reputation for being sight readers. We can sight read anything, chuck it in, and instantly, you know, that's why people come to the UK to record film sessions, because we can just do it really quickly. It's not the case with other people necessarily, but so many creative artists, part of their practice is learning on the job, learning new skills, wanting to try something, recognizing they don't know how, so they just get on and find out how. And a lot of that is positively by trial and failure, which again will park my soapbox about the importance of positive failure somewhere else. We'll come back to that maybe. You know, and I think that's what makes us resilient. And I think that's one way in which the creative us can help us in that HE environment. We do know how to learn. We do know how to adapt. What we don't necessarily know, because we're not helped, is what we're adapting to and what the rules of the game are. Everybody assumes, A, we know what a learning outcome is or means, and B, we all agree. Sorry, advanced HE doesn't agree. So, you know, we're on a kind of hiding to nothing as to what we mean. And yet it gets banded around. Oh, yeah, learn, well, bonkers. And you then get these learning outcomes that are 4 paragraphs long. What?
Yeah, we could do a whole session on learning outcomes. Just in terms of your experience then, so coming into higher education and now looking back on it, is it possible to identify things that could have helped you? Because, you know, lots of artist educators come into HE. You were one of them, like you say, you found yourself teaching without any experience of that. But I mean, what would have helped you? What would have made that less of a shock and more supportive, do you think? Because obviously universities put on things like PG certs. I used to run one, you know, that's usually the vehicle. It's like, you come in, we stick you on this course, and that will deliver the institutional knowledge and understanding that you need to be a useful educator. But I mean, was that your experience, or was there something that would have been better?
Well, no, because as I said, mine was very much in at the very, very, very deep end, and just a huge assumption I knew what I was doing in the HE space rather than anything else. So I think using that, and that's, if I think about the other institutions I've moved into, that's a pretty consistent first day on the job, is a massive assumption from the institution that I know what I'm doing, not necessarily based on evidence. So one of the first things I do is, for a start, let's acknowledge the dirty secret. Most creative teachers, when they first start, probably haven't had any formal pedagogic training or experience to date. So what they tend to do, as indeed did I, is you fall back on the teaching you've experienced, and you hopefully select the good bits and acknowledge and recognize the bad bits and don't reproduce the bad bits. But that's not necessarily the case. You know, conservatoires are somewhat still set in a very old-fashioned master-pupil relationship, which is, I kind of get it, but it's not good for the students, and it's not necessarily really effective learning in the broader sense. You might come out as the most fantastic ... piano player, cellist, singer, whatever, but nowadays you have to acknowledge the fact that degree learning is the broader picture as well. And there's another contradiction. Are we learning the craft, or are we doing you know, the whole student outcome thing. Is that what we're are we doing? Oh, we're doing two at the same time. Okay. Does anybody say we're doing two at the same time? So me as a flute teacher, I don't play the flute. Me as a flute, which bit? Tell me again. That conversation simply doesn't happen, and it needs to.
As you're talking, the thing I'm sort of feeling really is, and it's, I mean, I love that thing you said about sight reading. I just think I didn't know that factoid about sort of that pragmatism, but I think that I absolutely identify with that, because when I became a course leader, just like you, if I think about the drift into kind of that profession, the idea that there is a linear path or a plan, or indeed any type of onboarding, there's none. And the ability to sight read, I would absolutely now, I've never used that analogy before, but I know I'm going to steal it, because that is exactly, effectively, I think, when you looked at the people who were sinking and swimming, and their skill sets, I think the ability to sight read and improvise, and to sort of perhaps find some joy, and to find some of their own agency in that moment, that's the ones that I've seen when people have almost enjoyed that deep end feeling. But I don't think the deep end, I used to sometimes, you hear these ideas of institutions that the deep end is how you learn, but you would never expect that. You would never extend that to a student. You'd never say, in you go, sink or swim. We all know that that's not how it's done, that would be deeply exclusive, and sort of it would bake in existing worries, and it would sort of bake in all sorts of other things. So no, but it is true that when you come into a place of teaching as an educator, you're so often just, swimming. But yeah, I think really the real issue here, as you talk about the full student experience, and I think you alluded at the beginning to kind of dealing with dimensions of mental health and pastoral care and all of the scaffolding that's around the core discipline that they've come to do. My worry always with educators, artist educators, being unprepared, was that they were having an experience where they felt at risk themselves of not being able to give the right advice, becoming too involved, not involved enough. There would be colleagues of mine who believed that a student's tears had nothing to do with them whatsoever, because that was nothing to do with the subject specificity. And then you'd have, on the other spectrum, the sort of the tutors or the educator artists who were like so themselves getting involved in that they suddenly, they were giving 2-hour tutorials to a discussion not around the flute, but around a situation at home. And you would see these two spaces get sort of colliding, and in the middle there'd be a student. And it was the failure of confidence that the failure of kind of direction was producing in staff that used to worry me perhaps the most. It was the fact that people felt at risk. And then, because the student voice was so strong and so powerful, if you did get it wrong, if you perhaps did feel that you'd given the wrong advice, the artist educator then felt doubly at risk, because they felt institutionally at risk because they had given the wrong advice, or they'd stepped over a line, or not given advice, or not answered an email after 6 o'clock, or whatever it was. And so for me, I always saw that tension around the full student experience and the lack of onboarding for staff to be a proper piece of, I won't use the word negligence as like it was a proper blind spot, like a proper blind spot. I don't know what what your views are on having to meet the student as this complete personality with all that they would bring into their discipline. I mean, I'm sure that was something you saw all the time.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I know why we call students and teachers, but it allows us to forget that we're all people. We're all people, we're all human, and we're all grown-ups to a greater or lesser extent in terms of our behaviors. But the reality is, predominantly, we're adult. And we need to treat each other kindly and sensibly, in the sense of yeah, I mean, that really difficult decision for a teacher who's presented with a student in floods of tears. Now, if it's within a class, and this is particularly true in the sort of one-to-one music conservatoire sector, nowadays, first thing that will probably go through the teacher's mind is, am I at risk? Not what's prompted the student to, is that, and then it's going to be, is that something I said? Now, there will still be, I am sure, some teachers who would look at that situation and do versions of toughen up. You are going to get criticism in your career as a whatever it is. Toughen up. We think, well, that's probably the least useful piece of information ever. And even more so in this particular scenario. And the same gets said or discreetly implied to teachers. Toughen up. You think, hang on, that's not what resilience is about. And I've yet to meet an unresilient creative artist who has had a career earning money, more often than not on a freelance basis. So as ever, next gig comes out of the reputation, you know, so we're not talking about people who don't know what they're doing. They know it enough to be paid to do it, and over and over. So they're resilient. And they also know about knockbacks. They know about rejection. And this is actually really useful stuff to bring to the teaching space, teaching and learning space. I've been there. I know what it's like to feel ripped off by a contractor. You know, so I know what it's like to have that criticism that you take to heart. So there's a useful conversation to be had there with the student about, let's talk about the feelings that that criticism is evoking in you and whether they are useful. That's the first thing. Whether they're reasonable, because actually more often than not, it's a reasonable response. Somebody says, you know, your work was horrible, because, you know, critics are not necessarily the most objective people in the world, giving you something useful to work with. I hated this before. Well, and but it, you know, to start that sentence, I've had that, let's talk it through. It's not about you. And I've found quite useful with students to talk about a kind of professional me, which is the one who turns up for work and the one who does stuff and the one who I'm happy to take professional critique of my work. And then there's the personal me. There's the 3 o'clock in the morning me, which is quite private and internal. And I'll deal with that in my own way. And if the student can begin to consider those two things, that the work me is somehow different, I've found that helpful. And I've found that staff, teaching staff, have found that helpful as well. It's, you know, the dirty secret that doesn't get outed nearly enough is I'm struggling. It just doesn't get said because it's seen as vulnerable. There's this slight sense of it's toxic and it might be catching. So let's not talk about, you know, John in the corner, who is a fab teacher but seems to be having a tough time. Let's sort of move away. You know, think no. We're supposed to be a team in this. We're supposed to be working together in the students' interests. So
to look at that word you mentioned, vulnerability there, which I think is always an interesting word in education, because in some ways that can produce positive effects in students when they see that you are vulnerable, you're a human being, particularly in adult learning. But I'm interested in some of these factors that perhaps produce that feeling of vulnerability in artist educators. And one of those things is often research, because, you know, you're working in a university and yet, like you say, you might have 25 years experience of being a cellist or a flautist. And it's not that you haven't done research, but you've done practice. And there's always this interesting debate in creative higher education providers around practice versus research, or research as practice. And often this tension is created where staff come in and then suddenly they're expected to suddenly do research, but not the sort of research that they might be familiar with. They're asked to write referable articles, and it's like, hang on a second. So what's your view on that? On that expectation that providers can sometimes place on artist educators, is that valuable? Because you could on one hand say, well, now you are working for a university and you do need to demonstrate research to be working at that level, to be working in an academic institution. But is that a realistic expectation, or does that produce unnecessary vulnerability, do you think?
I think that this is where terms frustrate. I really despair of the word academic. And even more, I mean, I would, in even the top Russell Group universities, because what's the other? It presents itself as as sort of the gold mark somehow, academic, as opposed to what? Learning's learning. It and I think for a creative practitioner moving into the HE space and being confronted with this word academic, it's kind of terrorizing. It's and I mean that, I choose that word carefully, because there is a sort of prejudice implied. Let's all wave our doctorates at each other, etc., etc. And you think, well, what about the outstanding international concert pianist? I don't care whether they've got GCSE maths or not. They are fantastic at what they do, and in their they can sight read. In their performance selves, they potentially offer a quite remarkable model for students to learn from. So this academic thing is a red herring in terms of, no, not red herring. That's the wrong language. I think it's a problem. I completely understand if you go back to the way, why higher education came into being in the first place, way back in the Dark Ages. Well, in truth, it was to perpetuate the establishment. So, plus ça change. The problem comes when one thing is prioritized over the other. And I think that puts students in a tricky position. A student going to drama school, let's say, to learn to be an actor. So they're quite explicit. That's why they've joined that course. They want to be a professional actor. I think a program that is well designed and a program that's well designed will make really clear why that needs to include an element of critical engagement, of actual thinkingness and knowledge, and drawing on resources, and with a small r, the value of research in how you then embody that in the playing of your role or the learning of your role. So a good program will make it really clear what the value of that is and why it's so important. And your creative teaching staff will all buy into that. They will all equally understand why knowledge of, when I say Bob Fosse, previous knowledge of that to the student, if they know about it, then they understand what it is I'm trying to do in a dance class where we might be exploring Bob Fosse. It's that kind of stuff. Knowledge is knowledge. It's all, and in our vocational world, it doesn't matter whether it's performing arts or creative arts or visual, whatever. It's the same thing. We're all pointing towards developing a skill and a craft set that we can earn money out of. The sad truth I find is that so many creative teachers, artist teachers, have begun to lose sight of their art because of the pressures on the teaching. And so it's begun to undermine, whereas actually the teachingness of it ought to be able to liberate the art more, because we're asked to think about things that we don't normally think about. If you're designing a project for a student, for example, you might just think, well, let's take a simple example. Let's supposing we want to explore something like book illustration, for example. So as the artist teacher, what would make a good book to play with in terms of an illustrative model? What do I need to know about that? All that kind of stuff. I think that's where the teachingness and the learningness start to interface with the creativeness. One of my other pet frustrations, I've never been able to crack this, and I've always wanted to, is conservatoires quite often, and drama schools too, have quite a lot of extracurricular stuff. And often in conservatoires, music schools, the extracurricular stuff, the stuff that isn't formally part of your degree, time-wise can be really substantial. And all that extracurricular stuff, I'm thinking, that's such a rich resource of learning. Surely, as a curriculum designer, I can find a way of capturing that for students so that they can use it towards their degree. I almost don't have to do anything other than provide them with an opportunity. What I bring to the table is, and here is how you could use it. Here is how we can, if you like, do what creative artists do, monetize your output. We want to sell it. I can create the most wonderful picture in the world. I can't, I'm a rubbish artist, but I can create something. I can choose to sell it or not to sell it. If I have to sell it, it better be sellable.
It talks to a lot of the work film I've been doing recently around sort of this it's a bit of a rebalancing with doing over thinking, and we've spoken to a lot of people recently, particularly artists, and there's been a real emphasis on this idea of just do it, for want of a better word. You do first rather than think, and it does feel like that, given what's happening, particularly with technology at the moment, with AI, that perhaps there is a greater need to re-emphasize or revalue the doingness that is very common to artist educators. Like you say, people come in with a practice, often they end up parking that practice to do this other thing, which is academia, because that's what they think they should be doing. And actually what is really valuable is the ability to keep doing, and it's the doing that is increasingly what produces change in the world, and developing those muscles and helping students then develop their doing muscles. Phil, what are your thoughts on this? This is where we've ended up, isn't it?
I mean, yes, and I'm like a rose between two Tonys today. It's very nice. As Tony Castro, as you were talking, I could, and this isn't a fully formed thought, but as you were talking about sort of like power of language, sort of the word academic, and then about you come in to do one thing and then you end up doing something else. This was very resonant for me, because I think it's about how easily we are displaced. We displace all the time, and it's sort of such a strange, inevitable thing that and I would hear this always from my colleagues, where they enter the HE space as invited in as artists, practitioners, and then at some point, not only are they displaced linguistically because the words that they use or their expression of themselves suddenly you have to replace that with some other words to ensure that your status in that institution is kind of understood, and then you use that word more often, and it's this kind of you get done unto, but you also do it to yourself, and it's this thing that I don't know anybody who has not had this strange out-of-body experience to discover that they have got lost on the way. And I think the word academic is very interesting, because I often think that it's about, I think it's like he doth protest too much. Academic is a word that's used, I think, because secretly, privately, there is a fear that education isn't taken seriously enough, and it's sort of somehow, so I think there's a lot of language games people play in HE, particularly around creative education, because it's coming from a deep place, I think, of self-loathing, really, when it comes to value. So I think there's a value piece there. So I would say a lot of those tensions come from the self-loathing of like, I'm just a doer, I just do this, I'm not a thinker, all that kind of stuff. And all of that is terribly unhelpful and produces these distorting effects, which I think, as you were talking to, these weird distorting effects where people end up, I think, emotionally feeling hollowed out, as if they've betrayed themselves. And but Tony's point was about doing, and about, I don't know about you, but the moment that you then start to do the thing that you can do, your confidences can rush back. They can rush back in. And this thing with students too, this thing you said about why is it that they're doing this extraordinary extracurricular stuff, and yet they can't pull that down into an assessment.
Yeah.
It can't get double counted. It's kind of, it's othered. I absolutely think, from a curriculum design point of view, that, and I think this is where Tony and I are moving to more and more, that the siloing that HE loves, the sort of the need to have research in a box and then this thing over here, that all of that has got to be dismantled, because I think HE is in disrepute. It feels like it is unable to meet the speed and the changes and the agility of what's actually happening. And I feel quite protective of HE, particularly in the UK. It's this extraordinary structure, all these young people doing extraordinary things, and yet I can't hear a good word to be said about it at the moment, not from anyone, from employers, people who are in it, people who are outside it. It's like it's this tragic space. It's this tragic space, and the tensions that you're talking about, I think, are key to understanding that unhappy space that it's in. Because, as you say, at the end, it is a space produced by people, and I think the people inside are feeling lost, and they're feeling lost because the very activities that it's good at linguistically are being displaced. The things that you go to do, students go to learn something, and suddenly they discover that that's the thing they want to do, they can't do because they've got to do all these other things that sit around it. The people who come in to teach, who are invited to be extraordinary and to be practitioners, discover that that's the thing they cannot do. And so this weird displacement, this adjacency that takes place in the one space that should really know how to do it by now, right? It should really know how to do it. So I think that you're talking about sort of these specific institutions, but my feeling is that paradox is playing out all over the place, to be honest.
I think you're right. And just to take your kind of metaphor a little bit further, and let's not get into this, I think there's a third layer, which is that management are running a completely different institution. They run the one that they think is existing, and it's not necessarily what is happening downstairs, as it were, on the floor, and it's definitely not the one the students are in.
No.
I was always quite inspired by an old colleague of mine who said in Canada, I think the practice was that if you were a vice chancellor, you always had to teach. You had to keep teaching, so you had to teach at least one class a week of first years, just to maintain that understanding of who's coming in. I just thought that is such a great idea. It's like, it doesn't matter how high up you are, get in the classroom and see who your customers are, who's actually in, who the students are, what their concerns are. Yeah. So can I ask you then, Tony, so how did you support your staff around this? What advice would you give to your staff? Because you obviously got to a management position in a creative provider. How did you help staff negotiate these tensions? What practical advice did you find was useful to them?
The main way I helped, I think, is literally just talking to them. Simple as that. Out the problem. Mm-hmm. Let's be open about it, and let's talk about it, either individually or in a group as appropriate to the subject matter. And talking about it is the very, very least you could do, because then this business, what Phil's talking about teaching, creative teaching staff feeling othered and out of their depth. If we just talk about it, that helps hugely, because they realize they're not the only one. And the other thing we don't, what I would also do to staff in that situation is basically saying, what you're feeling is real. It's real to you. You're not at fault in feeling what you feel. Now we can look at the causes and the whys and how we go, but it is real. You're not dreaming it, and it is important to talk it out, because anything that is getting in the way of you as an artist teacher, we as managers, that should be front and center, our focus. Because if our artist teachers in this vocational HE world, if our artist teachers don't feel totally on their game, we are failing as managers totally. And that's not good failure. I'm a big fan of, as I say, positive failure. That's not good failure. That's really clumsy in a very negative way. And you think, no, that should not be happening, not nowadays. You think about it, we know more about adult teaching and learning now than we ever have done before. We shouldn't be getting some basic things wrong. And it really isn't rocket science.
That's interesting, because it feels like the problem there isn't one of teaching. It's like you say, we know a lot about teaching and learning, but this isn't a teaching and learning issue necessarily. It's a community issue. It's a sense of belonging. It's an identity issue, which is a bit different. Yeah. And I think it reminded me of when I ran a PG Cert course. It was interesting because there was a curriculum, which is all the things you would expect around learning theories and assessment. But actually, probably the more valuable thing was bringing together a group of people who were all feeling suitably displaced and getting them into contact with each other to go, oh, thank goodness, it's not just me. And over the course of 8 or 9 months, they went, okay, this is a bit weird. You're finding it weird. But the fact that we've named it and outed it, it was the most useful thing to do in that situation. That's interesting.
And it's probably worth reminding that the reason the students have come to this course is because of the artist teachers on it. In music conservatoires, that can still mean literally a named person. I want to go to that conservatoire because that person teaches there and I want to be with them. But more generally, I go to that drama school because I know I can see that I'm taught by people who are called actors and directors and choreographers. That's what I want to experience.
Yeah, people who are doing
so it's that they are the core of it, and we abandon them at our peril. That's not a smart way of managing this very, very unique bunch of artist teachers. It's quite an extraordinary pool. The other thing I think is worth mentioning, perhaps, this may be just me, I suspect not. As an artist, I carry my imposter syndrome pretty close to the surface. It doesn't take much to prick that little bubble. When I'm in a conservatoire or drama school, I do know what I'm doing in terms of my creative skill, my artistry. But that little hint of imposter is always there. And if somebody nudges or critiques my teaching, you think, oh, then that imposter jumps right up to the surface. You think, so I know how to manage my artist imposter syndrome, but my teacher imposter syndrome, that's quite lively if I'm not careful. Never with the students, always with other staff. And when it comes to, as Phil referenced, meetings where the language that's used is almost designed to other me. Particularly in, say, an exam, not an exam meeting, when you're talking exam grades and all that kind of stuff. God, the level of QA banter and blah blah blah. You think, I've lost track of where we are now.
Tony, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. And I would say, for anyone listening to the recording, if there's any musicians teaching in higher education who need to adapt to working in an institution so they feel more confident and focused and purposeful, then Tony Castro is the person to speak to. So
that's very kind. Thank you
for professional coaching around this area. So thank you, Tony. Thank you, Phil. Really, really interesting conversation about how to support artist educators.
Thank you very much. I love what you're both doing. So keep doing it, please. It's really, really